Imagine a workplace where the casualty rate is higher than on the front lines of a war. It is 1920. You are deep in the rainforests of the Pacific Northwest. The trees around you are Douglas firs and redwoods, ancient giants rising 300 feet into the mist. Suddenly the silence is shattered by the scream of a steam whistle. The ground beneath your boots begins to tremble. Above your head, a massive log weighing 20 tons, the size of a school bus, is flying through the air at 30 miles per hour. It is suspended by a thin steel cable, groaning under the tension. It crashes through the underbrush, snapping smaller trees like matchsticks, swinging wildly as it races toward the landing. If you are standing in the wrong spot, you are dead. If a cable snaps, you are cut in half. If a branch falls, you are crushed. This was not a battlefield. It was a logging camp, and the machine controlling this chaos was the Steam Skidder. The crews who worked the woods had a name for the conditions created by this machine. They called it the Widowmaker. This is the story of the most dangerous machine in the history of the American frontier, and the iron men who risked everything to feed the world's hunger for timber. To understand why this machine was built, you have to understand the geography of the problem. In the late 19th century, the easy timber was gone. The flat lands had been cleared. What remained were the massive forests of the mountains, sitting on steep, rugged slopes where no horse or ox could effectively work. The timber companies faced a logistical nightmare. They had millions of dollars in wood sitting on the sides of mountains with no way to get it down. Dragging logs by animal power was agonizingly slow and dangerous for the beasts. They needed a way to defy gravity, they needed speed, and they needed steam. The revolution began with a simple machine called the steam donkey. Invented by John Dolbear in 1881, it was essentially a steam engine attached to a winch. It allowed crews to drag logs using a cable rather than animals. But dragging a log on the ground, known as ground leading, was still flawed. The massive logs would plow into the earth, getting stuck on rocks, stumps, and mud. It was friction against brute force. Then, in the early 1900s, engineers had a terrifyingly brilliant idea. What if, instead of dragging the log through the obstacles, we lifted it over them? This was the birth of high-lead logging, and it changed the woods from a workplace into a death trap. The engineering required to make a 20-ton log fly was immense. It required a pivot point high in the sky. This created the most legendary and insane job title in industrial history, the high climber. Before the heavy machinery could run, the high climber had to prepare the spar tree. He would choose the tallest, strongest tree in the center of the operation. Armed with nothing but climbing spurs on his boots and a rope belt around his waist, he would ascend the giant tree. As he climbed, he used an axe and a crosscut saw to chop off every limb, leaving a bare pole. When he reached the top, sometimes 200 feet in the air, he faced the ultimate test. He had to top the tree. He would saw through the trunk, causing the top 30 or 40 feet of the tree to fall off. When that heavy top broke away, the reaction was violent. The spar tree would whip back and forth wildly, sometimes swinging in a 10-foot arc. The climber had to hang on for his life, riding the whipping pole high above the forest floor. If the trunk split, he would be crushed. If he lost his grip, he would fall to his death. Once the tree was calm, he would rig massive iron pulleys, weighing hundreds of pounds to the top. This spar tree became the center of the spiderweb. Enter the Lidgerwood Tower Skidder. While the steam donkey was small, the Lidgerwood was a monster. It was a massive, self-propelled factory mounted on steel rails. Some models were so large they spanned 2 parallel railroad tracks. The Lidgerwood solved the problem of the spar tree by bringing its own. It featured a massive steel tower, rising 70 to 100 feet in the air, bolted directly to the machine. It was the ultimate predator of the forest. The mechanics of the operation were a symphony of violence. The system used 2 main cables. The first was the haulback. This lighter cable was run out into the forest around a series of pulleys and attached to the back of the carriage. Its job was to pull the heavy cable out to where the logs were cut. The second cable was the main line. This was the muscle. It was thick steel wrapped around the main drum of the steam engine. When the logs were choked, wrapped with a cable noose, the engineer opened the throttle. The Lidgerwood didn't just pull, it lifted. The nose of the log would rise into the air, clearing the stumps and rocks. Then the machine would reel it in at terrifying speeds. A Lidgerwood crew could clear 40 acres of dense forest in a matter of days. It was efficient, it was profitable, and it was deadly. For the men on the ground, the choker setters, danger came from every direction. The most feared killer was the bite of the line. Because the cables ran through pulleys and around stumps to change direction, they formed invisible triangles of tension. If a stump pulled out or a block broke under the strain, the cable would snap tight into a straight line instantly. If a man was standing inside that angle, inside the bite, there was no escape. The cable moved faster than the human eye. Men were decapitated. They were cut in half. It happened so often that old loggers could tell who was new by where they stood when the line went tight. Then there was the communication problem. The engineer sitting in the Lidgerwood cab was hundreds of yards away. He couldn't see the men in the brush. He relied on the whistle punk. The whistle punk was usually a young boy or a new guy. His job was to hold a wire connected to the steam whistle on the donkey engine. He watched the crew. When the logs were ready, he yanked the wire. 1 toot, go ahead on the main line. 2 toots, stop. 3 toots, back up. If the whistle punk wasn't paying attention, or if he tripped, or if the wire got snagged on a bush, the signal could be wrong. The engineer might throttle up the main line while a man's hand was still wrapped around the cable. Fingers and arms were lost routinely, but perhaps the most insidious danger came from above. As the logs flew through the air towards the spar tree, they would often swing wide and crash into standing trees. The impact would shake the forest. Dead branches, called Widowmakers, would break loose from the canopy high above and fall silently. A 3-inch branch falling from 200 feet hits with the force of a cannonball. In the days before hard hats were common, this was a silent death sentence. Despite the carnage, the work never stopped. The demand for lumber to build America's growing cities, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Seattle, was insatiable. The men who worked these machines were a breed apart. They were paid well for the risk, but they paid a heavy price in blood. They lived in remote camps, eating thousands of calories a day just to keep up with the physical demands. They took pride in their ability to survive the machine. By the 1940s and 50s, the era of the giant steam skidders began to fade. The invention of the diesel trucking industry meant that roads could be built directly to the trees. The chainsaw made falling trees faster and more precise. The massive, dangerous cable systems were replaced by smaller, more mobile yarders and tractors. The Lidgerwoods were scrapped. Their massive steel towers were cut up. Their boilers were left to rust. Today, if you hike deep into the second-growth forests of Washington or Oregon, you can still find them. The rotting sleds of old steam donkeys, rusted coils of steel cable half buried in the mud. They are silent monuments to a time when the woods were loud, dangerous, and driven by steam. Modern logging is a science. Operators sit in climate-controlled, armored cabs. They use computers to calculate cuts. It is safer, cleaner, and more sustainable. But the legend of the high climbers and the Steam Skidder crews lives on in the history of the American West. They were the toughest men in industry. They faced a mechanical monster every morning, and if they were lucky, they survived to hear the whistle blow at the end of the shift. Thanks for watching Titan Hall. If you enjoyed this look into the deadly history of the timber industry, hit the subscribe button. And let me know in the comments, the high climber had to ride a snapping tree 200 feet in the air with no safety harness. Was that the scariest job in history, Or was the Whistlepunk's responsibility even worse? See you in the next one.